Good morning. Uh, Marina Crane here from Sutina. I'm going to comment on the weather. It's still smoky out. I can't even see the foothills or the Rockies. And it's supposed to rain, but have I seen it? No, because if they did, it would clear up all this, all this smoke. Even though I'm indoors, but it's just been tragic this whole month. So this podcast, of course, I have time to do a lot of critiquing or soul searching, especially when it comes to Instagram. I usually do my Instagram, and then it transfers to my Facebook. So I find that a lot of the things that I like or talk about in with the Instagram is like sometimes I get really I put too much in. So on this podcast, I'm going to go through a couple of recordings and hopefully give you some insight into the way I think or why I think the way I do. The last podcast I was talking about the industrial schools that were started in the late 1800s, around the same time as the mass execution of Dakota warriors. They hung the largest execution in the United States happened in Mankato, Minnesota, where they hung 38 Sioux after 10 years of starvation and conflict. And that again too sort of percolated into Canada and this whole establishment of the Indian Act, and even this horrible man in the early 1800s called Duncan Scott or Campbell Scott. He's not even worth talking about, but the reality of it is, and again, the science of things, you can see the pandemic where so many people died. And so when I talk about the Indigenous people were susceptible to European diseases, and that obviously we didn't make really good slaves, but at the same time too, we perceived as being dumb and stupid and lower than a snake's belly. And so whatever means they tried to educate us, it's like in today's modern society they call it special needs or special education. I mean, if you have dyslexia or other conditions, of course, or even autism, but if you're part of the spectrum. And again, having and recruiting children, especially young boys, just children, to train them to become like workers, like ranch hands and farm hands, and like even as far back, 50 years ago or even 40 years ago. And even today, like you see in the state of Utah, you have a lot of immigrants who come in and work, and the same in Canada. A lot of Mexican workers come in because it's cheap labor. So they were trying to do that with Indigenous people too, but through the industrial school. There's no fairy tale, or don't try to gloss it over as if they were trying to educate us. Like we couldn't even leave the reserves without a pass system, or even hire a lawyer, anything. Like it was, we were wards of the government, just like somebody who's considered incompetent to look after themselves, like Britney Spears. Okay, so like I said, in the history, they were afraid that once they educated these young men, they'd go back and marry Indigenous girls like myself, and that I would convert them back to savages. I mean, that was their logic, and that was stated in the House of Commons in Parliament. I read the notes. Okay, so again, this whole tendency to want to have somebody be lesser than. So a lot of the stuff that I've been listening to talks about stuff like this, and it's really it's not in terms of corruption. I just find it really interesting what's out there and what people are talking about, not just Indigenous people, but just a general like people who know history. So we'll see. I don't know if I can get this to, like, if I can get her to. It's not allowing me to. Let's try.
The actual betrayal is not when your partner...
These are the women that we need to look up to.
Jesus is the most anti-slut shaming.
I guess in this article.
Okay, sorry. Like I said, it's... Pardon me, excuse me, and at the same time, I don't know how to edit these things out.
You know what the hell is wrong with women? We learn to call the bleeding beautiful. We learn to press flowers into the pages of our pain and hand them to people who never asked how the garden died. Those dead flowers of generations. Your great-grandmother swallowed a scream that became your grandmother's silence. That became your mother's patience. That became your apology. And that apology is becoming your daughter's first language. They didn't steal your voice. They stole your damn permission. The permission to be furious. The permission to be inconvenient. The permission to take up space in your own story. We are altars who forgot we were also fire. We are rivers who forgot we carved the canyon. We are winter who forgot we always become spring. We are graves that are still breathing. And the breathing is the most revolutionary thing we have ever done. Stay angry. Stay breathing. Stay here. They are counting on you not to.
I thought that was very insightful, especially when it comes to Indigenous women or women of color in the way they've silenced us. And that's why with my podcast, I'm saying, this is a narrative that all women need to talk about and be open about it. And and she talks about the apology, just the whole notion of women apologizing. And I want to go beyond just women of color. I know there are white women who feel this, and I think there's some sort of, I will call it something in the world that's happening, especially with a lot of fascism that's happening in countries where they're trying to take away the rights of women. And I think white women are feeling this. And I'll give you an example. I had an acquaintance. Every time I talk about things that were happening with Indigenous people, and she says, well, those are my people that did that to your people. And on behalf of my people, I apologize. And I used to just sort of tell her, it's funny. I was open with her, and I said, it's funny that you say that. I said, because when I hear you say that, I said, you're a white woman, a small white woman. And I said, and when you say it, I see behind you a million white people. I said that's how I see you. You're saying you're representing all white people. See, and again, that's from a notion of privilege that a person can say that, especially when somebody says to a black woman, when is the time that you're going to talk about? I don't know. It has to talk about racism or something. Anyway, it was a narrative. This white woman was confronting this black woman. And the black woman says, well, look at it this way. If I said to you as a white woman, when are you going to talk about black women? See, so when a white woman says to a black woman or a woman of color, when are you going to start talking about white women? When there's really like she's saying, don't you see the racism in that? So I think a lot of times people don't realize, especially people who come from a privilege or have been raised in privilege, and the way they try to navigate, and again, it's people need to have a voice. People need to understand, and if they learn something when they've befriended me and I'm no longer friends with them, I hope that's a lesson, or hope they understand. Now, here's another recording
So one thing we're not talking about that we should be.
I think that the story of our civilization today is the lack of romantic love. I think that the lack of relationships, this is not a sentimental issue. This is an existential issue that we're actually getting in here. And I think that we need to have a better scientific understanding of what exactly is happening and what's going to happen. This is not just demography. This is the question of whether life is actually worth living going forward, and not whether life is going to continue going forward.
How many men sitting around in a room does it take to diagnose the problem of withering interest in romantic relationships? We showed you some science here, says the guys who clearly haven't read any of the social science, demonstrating that when women live with men, they have an extra 7 hours of domestic labor per week, that women typically bear the vast majority of the mental load and the emotional labor of keeping the relationship afloat and alive and connected. All the data showing how many women in long-term relationships with men end up with autoimmune diseases as a result of overfunctioning for a grown-ass man. Like, we've literally been studying the institution of heteromarriage for at least half a century. I took several social science classes on the institution of marriage 25 years ago when we were covering data that went 25 years back before that. So all these groups of men everywhere sitting around lamenting the decline of romantic relationships. If you can't be bothered to just ask a curious question and look into the 5 decades of data that we have, I don't believe you're seriously interested in solving this problem. But hey, if studies aren't your thing, then you could also just get online and listen to women talk about their shared experiences in romantic relationships. You could just apply whatever pattern recognition skills that you have to hearing women out about what it is that is causing them to lose interest in romantic relationships. There is a path available to us to have fulfilling hetero-romantic relationships. But that path is going to require curiosity, openness, and accountability. And I think right now, most men are so far from being able to even just be curious about what the experience of women is in most hetero relationships, that we're gonna go through a dry spell of 10 or 20 years. I personally think that dry spell is going to reorder society as fewer and fewer women prop men up who then go on to make an impact in the world, and those women instead just go out and to make their impact in the world. And the world will end up being influenced by women who are largely more consensus driven, who tend to value the most vulnerable members of society and prioritize them instead of the men they would have been propping up who would have gone out in the world and made sure to protect hierarchy. I think this worldwide dry spell might end up being the best thing that has happened to humanity. And I even think that on the other side of it, we might have really fulfilling romantic relationships again.
So one thing we're not talking.
So the first recording was from a handler, like her social media. Her name is Yumama Graves. That's Yumamagraves. And this last video, this was from a lady called Hope Peddler. And, when she's talking about dry spell, like it's real. Like, that's why I said there's this atmosphere of just women, not just women of color, but all women who are saying, like, we're going through this dry spell. And most of the women that I've talked to who've, like, they're in 60s and 65 now, and they just say, well, no, I'm done with this. And again, too, like for me, it's been 50 years now, like going through this dry spell, because again, if the man isn't curious enough or doesn't have the knoweth-all to even have any openness around me, then it's very pointless. And like, I'd been talking with my sister, and we were talking about a fellow who had just lost his wife, and how he had a history of being promiscuous, like cheating on his wife, like he'd go on binges, and now that his wife is gone, he's in really bad shape because he's grieving and just really unconsolable in drinking. And the comment was like, well, he's in a really fragile state now. But again, too, the capacity to find romantic love again, is based on the quality or the like what a woman will be able to engage in. And a lot of women will not tolerate men who've had a history of having so many children or who are cheaters. And again, too, I think a lot of women have, like I said, this dry spell, and it leads to a lot of men who become incel, where they just isolate and sort of cloister themselves away. Especially when it comes to, we'll come into other issues of why I think this dry spell really drives men into extreme behavior.
Your testicles are evidence in a trial you did not know you were on. Across the apes, relative testis size tracks something deeply unromantic: sperm competition. A gorilla silverback can monopolize access to several females. Once he wins the physical contest, there is relatively little competition inside the female reproductive tract. Gorillas, therefore, have remarkably small testes for their enormous bodies. Chimpanzees live at the other extreme. Females mate with multiple males, so selection favored much larger testes and much greater sperm production. The fight continues after mating. Humans land between them. Our relative testis size and sperm production are greater than a gorilla's and far below a chimpanzee's. That does not reconstruct one perfect prehistoric bedroom. It does tell us that our ancestry was probably neither absolute harem control nor unrestricted promiscuity. The rest of the body gives the same untidy answer. Human males average roughly 16% heavier than females, far less dimorphic than gorillas, but not physically identical either. Men also carry substantially more muscle. There was male competition, just not at gorilla intensity. These clues cannot prove one mating system. Bodies are not legal documents, but they make one claim difficult to defend: that humans were designed for zero rivalry, zero strain, and one exclusive partner for an entire adult life. The evidence points instead toward pair bonds with pressure around the edges, attachment, competition, jealousy, occasional polygyny, and sex outside the bond. So be precise about the scandal. Humans are built to bond. We are not built to remain automatically and exclusively bonded to one person until death. The pair bond came from evolution. Till death do us part came from somewhere else. Your testicles are evidence in a trial you did not know you were.
So, again, like this is like a total understanding of healthy human sexuality, because if the baseline of humanity, now be open-minded about this, and like you can say, oh, she's a conspiracy theorist. So be it. That's your opinion. Okay, so my opinion is like, okay, the baseline in theory is everyone's bisexual. Now, okay, I know, especially if you've been raised in religious dogma, but the reality of what he's saying is pair bonding. And that's the whole gist of things when a couple gets together and it's mutual, it's acceptable. I think I made a comment about that in my last podcast where I talked about B1 and B2 and W and R, and how B1 and B2 had been married, and yet they had more than 10 children outside of their relationship with their married spouse. So they had a married spouse with like at least 8 children, or they had children with the one female that they were married to, but they had numerous relationships with women who were consensual and had other children up to 10. So we'll say on the average, these two B1 and B2 had like about 20 children. And again, pair bonding, okay? Because again, it says until death do you part. Only in pair bonding, not in terms of religiosity. Whereas with W and R, a lot of this pair bonding was very, I think, I don't like really distorted because it had to do with sexual assaults, and again too non-consensual. So I think this whole "thou shalt not," and I think the relationship men have with their fathers. Again, this is just my own opinion, my own conspiracy, has a deep impact in how men perceive women and how they perceive women in terms of relationships. That's just my opinion.
I think it's worth saying, if it's not clear at this point, I think it is clear, but it might not be. Women bleeding every month, that is the original blood covenant with Source or God. It's literally the original covenant. Women's bodies from day one have carried a direct cyclical blood-based connection to creation itself. So any religion saying that they have a covenant with God or with Source is just kind of borrowing from the natural one that women just are born with. And I'm sure you know this also, but patriarchy has spent thousands of years trying to recreate that covenant without us, through things like war and through violence and through the shedding of blood in sacrifice and blood oaths and things like that. And of course, bloodshed on the battlefield. And all of that, at least symbolically, is an attempt to manufacture through force a covenant with Source or with God. Men have always needed to spill blood to feel bound to something sacred. Women we just bleed on our own every month. So when we talk about ancient rites and covenants and sacrifices, we need to remember that the original covenant was already happening in women's bodies, and some of them tied to the same cycles as the moon and the tides. We've never had to resort to violence, and it's just built into women as a genre. And it's worth thinking about the fact that we've built entire religious structures around men trying to prove worthiness through bloodshed and copying that. I think it's worth saying, if it's not clear at this point, I think it is clear, but it might not be. Women bleeding every month, that is the original.
So now the last person that was talking about the testes, his handle is the Ancient Dog. And this lady who's talking about menstruation is the origin covenant with Source. Her name is Otherwell 2025. So when we're talking about these bonds that like men bond to something sacred, I'll use an analogy of like when a married couple have been married for so long and now they're seniors, and the woman passes away. Now, the difference, too, that I have found out, too, is that, like, with women and the biology, like, when they choose to have children, a lot, like, their identity is tied at every birth 5 years. So for one child, 5 years of her identity is lost within that child. And then when she recovers from child rearing for the first 5 years of that child, she regains her identity. So say, for example, someone in the family dies. It's the woman whose children that she's been attached to in this, we'll call it this covenant, that helps her recover from grief a lot sooner than men. And at the same time, too, I think the sorrow is so deep because of that maternal instinct. Like, for example, when my younger brother died, my mother, she couldn't speak English. She was in shock. She just spoke her first language, which was Dakota Sioux. And the grieving process like took a long time, like took a year. And we followed our customs in grieving. Whereas like with men, because they don't have their bodies don't go through all that hormonal shift when it comes to a woman raising, like giving birth. When this woman is talking about like what do you call the bond of something sacred, that shedding of blood, it's that, but yet in again the science, the neuroscience, and the way we're thinking about how the brain works is like it's amazing. So a lot of these things, I think, for both men and women, is to deconstruct and understand grieving and the central nervous system and trying to find balance. And I think throughout mankind, at different ages and different levels, every culture has had to try and do this. So, like I said, her name is Either Well 2025. Now, let's see if I've got this right.
I find the fundamentalists of all the religions have the same 5 things in common. Women are always second-class citizens. The more conservative any religion is, Hinduism, Judaism, the more extreme fundamentalist conservative your sect of Christianity or Islam is, the more, God loves everyone, loves men a little bit more. And this is what Christianity is grounded on. And it's the opposite of Jesus. As far as fundamentalists go, they all believe violence is okay if my side does it. The more conservative your religion is, you have the sex hang-ups, you have the persecution narrative. They always focus more on punishment than healing. But the misogyny unites the crappiest elements of all the world's religions. And we see it in Islam all the time. We see it in Judaism. It's not the liberal or moderate Muslims and Jews who are being groovy and where men and women are getting along. And the reality is, if God loves men and women equally, then God is a feminist. Feminism is the belief that men and women should be treated equally and deserve equal access to all of society's privileges and rights. I am not a feminist. I'm what you call a female supremacist. I wish the women would just hurry up and take over already. That's where I'm approaching this from. I'm anti-man. I think testosterone rots the brain. I'm called a misogynist.
So you're not down with Pete Hegseth's new testosterone screenings for the military?
I've always supported gender-affirming care for the troops, and for everyone. So if Pete Hegseth really wants to announce to the rest of the world that he thinks America's elite fighting force are actually sissified Nancy boys with low T, this is what happens when you appoint guys who don't listen to science but listen to late-night infomercials in between their porn. You have to get a prescription to get... You want to go off on this? Because I'll do it. I got 20 minutes of material. You have to get a prescription to get testosterone therapy in this country. But because of the way they market it to lazy guys and old guys who are lazy and don't want to do sit-ups and watch the garbage they put in their body, you want to get your libido back? You want to be a man again? This is what Rogan does all the time. And I'm not talking about anabolic steroids. I'll leave that to the RFKs of the world. This testosterone therapy to give you vigor and give you sex drive and feel like you're younger. And they talk about it like it's a party drug now. Okay? And this is the sort of culture that the Kash Patels and the Pete Hegseths and the dude bros who are, boys, guys, homies, players, and dudes, but not in fact men. This is what they're steeped in. They don't listen to science. They listen to Rogan. So you should expect to see this go nowhere. This is humiliating. Do not be surprised if years from now we read about how the Joint Chiefs of Staff shut this shit down. Because what you're messaging to the entire world is that you don't think your own troops are manly enough. And again, Hegseth's contempt for women is well understood. I don't really know if he's going to be dealing with hormonal therapy for female troops. It's one of those things when Hegseth eventually leaves, add it to the list. I mean, this guy was hired, like most of them, because he's an incompetent. He hires these flunkies and fall guys because eventually they'll screw up so badly. As soon as it hurts him, then he just banishes them off to Christy Nome Island. Find the fundamentalists of all...
So this fellow is his handle is The Sacred Slope and John Fugue Slang. So, I really enjoy listening to these comments because, I'm not an American citizen, but a lot of what he's talking about in terms of there's people tend to be very lazy about things when life is worth living, and like he said, how does it reflect on people, especially men, and the whole nature of science and how men are out. There are some men who are out there actually really struggling, and the reason they're struggling is, and they don't want to admit they're struggling, is to project all that hatred towards women and towards science, especially when it comes to it didn't really occur to me, I did hear that they wanted to give more hormones to elite soldiers, but the reflection is that says to the world that the men in the United States aren't man enough, that they have to have this extra testosterone injected in them, and then at the same time too, it's so. Instead of understanding how to balance your central nervous system, they're just like getting addicted to, needles and instant gratification with, taking like a needle, an injection of medicine to improve their testosterone. And again, like I said, I'm just totally interested in what some of these people have been saying, because it does make sense. It truly does. And I hope you are enjoying some of the clips that I've been listening to.
Your dick will stop working. Facts, not feelings, nigga. Today we're going over 5 facts men hate. All right, fact number 1. A lot of y'all already know this. Less money equals less bitches. You're not getting no bitches without having some money. All right, fact 2. This is a very, very sensitive subject, but eventually your dick will stop working naturally, right? So that's why you got honey packs, you got Viagra, Cialis. I don't know what all the shit is called, but you get what I'm saying. Fact number 3. This is also sensitive, but the law typically favors mothers when it comes to kids. Your baby mama could be homeless underneath a fucking overpass. You still won't get full custody. Number 4 is a very hard pill to swallow to me, but your feelings don't matter in society, men. Nobody really gives a fuck. Everybody thinks that you guys are just supposed to be strong, not cry, not have hard times, not have bad days. I hate that one. All right, number 5. We know how much you guys love young bitches, but the young hoes don't really like you, okay? They like what you can provide. And I know some of you are like, well, I really don't give a fuck as long as I'm getting what I want out the deal. But the one little piece that you guys need to think about and know is that these same young hoes that you like and that you wife and all of these other things, they just use you for what you have, give you a little piece of pussy, the little 10 minutes that you want to fuck, and then they go fuck a broke young nigga with no car. So when your bitch tells you she's going to brunch or to lunch, she's really going to hunch. So yeah, I hope this helps. Let me know if I left anything off in the comment section. Your dick.
So, which again too, I mean, her handle is their ally love her. Okay, so well, which is just like, this is the whole humor of things, is because this is the reality. When you have older men who have to get operations, so they have a penis pump, so they get erect, or like Viagra and all this, because through their whole masculine lives, from being young men to like the engagement of porn at a young age, all this preconceived notion of how they're supposed to be so masculine throughout their lives, and conquering and bragging about how many women they've slept with, or just this whole, like what the other fellow said about testes and gorillas and chimpanzees and all this, like how there's this jockeying for position, and yet when as a man ages, all this sort of filters down, whereas with women I think it percolates up. So because there's more independence as the woman gets older, whereas the older man becomes more fragile in the sense of all the parts aren't working. And she's being very frank about it, because I do think men come in a point of crisis when all things start failing, and they really have to, like, it's like breaking from a cult. They have to go through heartbreak, and they have to find the courage to self-reflect and understand the parts of them that need to be changed. And it's a hard pill to swallow when you realize, yes, if it's the truth, a lot of young women, they have choices. And I think that's why a lot of older men are trying to put restrictions on young female sexuality, because they like she said, and again, these are women's choices. This isn't something fundamentally like a conspiracy that it doesn't exist. This actually does happen in society, in all walks of life. Okay, so again, even as women get older, if that bond breaks, it's okay. Like when I talk to women who've just been in violent relationships, and they're talk about divorce because they're breaking away from a violent relationship. I said, a lot of marriages don't end because of violence. A lot of marriages end because they've changed. People change, and so that's why when I talk about pair bonding is natural. I think sometimes till death do us part. That's a really hard pill to swallow, especially when people behave a certain way to each other. And it's not, and they're not happy. So let's see here.
In every country that you go to, usually the degree of progress can never be separated from the woman. If you're in a country that's progressive, the woman is progressive. If you're in a country that reflects a consciousness toward the importance of education, it's because the woman is aware of the importance of education. But in every backward country, you'll find the women are backward. And in every country where education is not stressed, it's because the women don't have education. So one of the things I became thoroughly convinced of in my recent travels is the importance of giving freedom to the woman, giving her education, and giving her the incentive to get out there and put that same spirit and understanding in the children. In every country that you go to.
And that in itself is part of what I talk about with Indigenous women, is when you go to communities and you see how impoverished they are, or how it's so hard to get jobs or even leave the community, is because of the way the women are treated. And so I know a lot of times when I've talked to Indigenous men, they say, oh, well, the woman is the one. But yet, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to actually act on it. I used to, when I went to high school, I've always been a sickly person with my asthma. And when I get sick, I instead of taking a week, I'd be away for 2 weeks just in recovery. And I'd go to school, and then I'd have to, like in math class, I had to prepare all night for a test. And the instructor openly in front of all my classmates put my name out there, and he says, Marina's been gone for 2 weeks, and she's the third highest score in our class. Now, why did he do that? Throughout my life as an Indigenous woman, I've had white teachers do that. And I'm going, why? It's a bit intimidating in the sense that I didn't ask for that, but yet at the same time, it's also a reflection that people thought I was stupid, or Indigenous women are stupid or not educated. And again, it's one thing for men to say it, but it's another thing to actually do it. It's in the action or the attitudes of men towards educated women. And until I actually see that, it's a reflection on society as a whole. And again, we're born into this systemic racist system, and we have to deconstruct it or learn how to understand what it is that we were born into. And that's part of why I do my podcast, because I think I'm hoping my podcast reaches northern parts of Canada and isolated Indigenous communities, because I think a lot of young women, and I let me put it this way, I had a grandmother, I had grandparents, but I know a lot of young people don't have connection with older Indigenous people. And because of that, there's that connection is not there. So even though I'm old, I'm putting it out there that the life experience that I've experienced and the misogyny and the lateral violence I've lived through is possible to overcome. And so I'm hoping that young women, not just Indigenous women, but I hope women and men sort of realize like, oh my goodness, and have some reflection of like an epiphany or an aha moment that some of these stories that I'm putting on my podcast resonate with you.
The oldest marriage pattern we can reconstruct does not look like free love. It also does not look like your grandparents' wedding. A comparative study of 190 hunter-gatherer societies found that marriage was often regulated by families, accompanied by bride service or exchanges, and usually only mildly polygynous. That matters because it destroys the fantasy that rules arrived only with farming, priests, and private property. Humans were organizing mating long before the state, but organizing is not the same as lifelong exclusivity. Consider the Hadza of Tanzania. They are modern people, not living fossils, but their marriage pattern is revealing. There is no elaborate wedding ceremony. A couple begins sharing a hearth and is recognized as married. Around 4% of men have 2 wives at once, usually temporarily. Divorce and remarriage are common enough that researchers describe the system as serial monogamy. People attach, they cooperate, they separate, then they attach again. This is where Sex at Dawn went too far. Its famous story of a freely promiscuous human past was attacked for cherry-picking evidence. The rebuttal matters. Our ancestors were not bonobos at a festival. Pair bonding is widespread across human societies and was probably crucial to our evolution. Human children require astonishing amounts of care. Mothers have always relied on networks, grandmothers, siblings, unrelated helpers, and often fathers. A stable partner could provide food, protection, and years of investment. The bond had real survival value. But nature gave us a bond, not a sacrament. It did not specify one partner, sexual exclusivity, no divorce, and 50 uninterrupted years. Your ancestors were not incapable of commitment. They were capable of repeated commitment. Culture did not invent love. It invented the promise that love must last forever. The oldest marriage pattern
Yeah, so he says love must last forever. That's culture. So even with that too, like when I grew up in my community and I saw the elders and the pair bonding, like it was just natural. People knew who the fathers were, and that was pair bonding. This whole religiosity, I think, was a shock when alcohol and drugs were introduced, and this notion of like white superiority because white people could handle alcohol. Again, like lateral violence or just colonial ways of thinking that, sort of disrupted the whole status quo of collective and holistic approaches to communities and bonding and healing. And the acceptance, like he said, there weren't even ceremony. Like even when I was growing up with my own peers, all of a sudden, and we called the slang shacking up. Like I was talking with my cousin, she says, the West Coast Indigenous people have different slang than the Prairie Indians, and justly so too. Even in Ontario, they have different slang terms for the same things, but we do. So again, it's interesting, like the diversity of Indigenous people as well as our slang terms. And I know this goes for other people as well. But in my community, it was like shacked up. Like there was no marriage. You just all of a sudden they were shacked up, and then after a few children, then they decided to get married. Like because under the Indian Act, in order for the child to have coverage, like with for health and just safety and education, there had to be a marriage. So again, the Indian Act really has done something for pair bonding traditionally or within cultures. And the last, the fellow again who had just what he just did, that's the same fellow who talked about he's called the ancient dog, and he's really interesting. So let's see here.
When you're in the right state of mind for it, because this one is a doozy, I highly recommend reading this article, and I'm going to go through some of the highlights of it. The men who want women to be quiet. The article dives into masculinism, which is apparently the misogynistic answer to feminism. The author writes, masculinism has been a great gift because factions with different views on, say, protectionism or Israel or big tech can all agree on the overreach of feminism and the need for a return to traditional gender roles. Far from being a fringe belief system, masculinism has become the single most important force uniting the American right, bringing together an unlikely constellation of pastors, posters, senators, preachers, influencers, podcasters, and fanboys. She writes, one of masculinism's central claims is that no one is talking about men. So true. Men's issues are not being discussed in Senator Josh Hawley's 2023 book, Manhood, The Masculine Virtues American Needs. They aren't being discussed in Tucker Carlson's documentary, The End of Men. They aren't being discussed in the panoply of Christian books available on Amazon, or their secular counterparts, such as Why Women Deserve Less. She goes into Nick Fuentes and his groypers, who say our number one political enemy is women, because women constrain everything, every conversation, every man, everything. He's even suggested that women be sent to breeding gulags. The good ones will be liberated, the bad ones will toil in the mines forever. The article goes on to give several extreme examples of the shock and awe rhetoric used by these men, as well as detailing how a lot of these men saying these absolute batshit things have infiltrated powerful positions of influence over people in our government. It's a long read and it's a hard read, but it really crystallizes something that needs to be brought to the forefront of our attention, which is this is a fight. This is the primary war that they are waging. And I'm not implying that women are the only group that is being oppressed by these men. They have hate enough to go around to virtually every group of people who aren't wealthy, white, straight men. But they are signaling unequivocally, clearly, from positions of power, that their primary objective is to control and punish women. I am not surprised by this in the least, because I have long believed, as I have said on here, that women are the revolution. As women divest from patriarchy in large part by not prioritizing romantic relationships and marriage with men and childbearing, they know that the very foundation of patriarchy is crumbling. But if you had any doubts about the ground on which they intended to wage this war, those doubts should be resolved now. But we are up to this moment. We were built for this moment. And I, for one, will not give them the satisfaction of my fear. When you're in the right state of mind for it.
And I agree with her. She's a young woman. And again, she's the one that's called Hope Peddler, her handle. And again, when I was in Indian residential school, and again, like I said, I didn't go to school in the building. We were bused to the nearest town. Other than my grandmother, who went to the same building, but she actually went to school there and farmed and was treated like a slave in those places. And the same with my mother, my parents. Why am I bringing this up is because when she talks about punishment, I didn't understand the word punishment until I went to residential school. And things that I had taken for granted, like how short my skirt could be, how I could wear my hair, all those things, if I didn't comply, I was punished. I was punished in the sense of like not being able to participate with others within the population. So, like even when she talks about how powerful people in positions of power have elevated themselves, like even with white supremacists, and like here in Alberta when we had those young men, these men training, like what I forget what they're called, but you know, it's cause to talk about, because again, like I said, there's one thing I can talk about Indigenous women, but I'm talking in women in general when it comes to like what women are saying. Yes, there's a dry spell. Women are not participating in having relationships because there needs to be a narrative, there needs to be a dialogue with our partners, as well as the restrictions of thou shalt not. If women are openly available for bonding and willing, like I said, and I talk about R1 and R2, or I mean B1 and B2, they had like 20 children. And now, even though they're pair bonded in Christianity, legally married, they pair bonded with numerous women, so that each one of them had fathered 10 children out of wedlock. But yet, in terms of just their relationships and having children, they had 20 each. And again, that's consensual. That's pair bonding, and this is with women who chose this. You know, it's one thing for a woman to choose to have a child. Like for me, I chose not to. So I chose not to pair bond with anybody, including married men. So for me, and this is what this young woman is saying, a lot of women are choosing not to have children and not to pair bond. And at the same time, hopefully it's having an effect on people. Because I think the older women that I've met who choose not to pair bond, I don't think it has the same power or influence as if a young woman, like in their 20s and 30s and 40s, are choosing not to pair bond. And that's the reality. And I think if men understood this about female sexuality, that we can go without, we can be hypersexual, but and we can think about sex every day of our lives, but doesn't mean to say that we're going to actively, physically engage in intercourse or any type of sexual stimulus with a partner. It's a choice that women have the ability or the capacity to do, whereas men's physiology and the way men were raised is so totally different, just based on their gender. And again, I think like what people are saying is these men have managed to position themselves in positions of power that
the oldest
that that's being challenged today.
Sex is how a lot of people get trauma bonded, because they have deep emotional wounds for which they have no emotional capacity to be present with, face, feel, process, and heal. They use sex as a coping mechanism to numb those feelings out and experience a sense of relief or freedom from those inhibitions. This becomes a very dysfunctional coping mechanism in someone's individual life and in relationships. Because when we lack emotional capacity and we use sex as a substitute, it can only be a very temporary solution, and then we're back to square one where we have to face what we need to face. And the more we go about coping this way, the more we depend on it, and the more this becomes an addiction. And a lot of people actually suffer from a sex addiction. The same is true for relationships, where a lot of people use sex as a means to connect, to communicate, to express themselves, and to feel a sense of connection to each other. In such relationships, betrayal also is very common, because the deeper emotional needs that we all have are still not being met, not because there's an issue with a relationship, but because we lack that capacity, and probably we started off the relationship on the wrong footing by first getting sexually involved, and then the emotional needs always remained shadowed. This is something we should not underestimate because we live in a society which has normalized being sexually promiscuous and not emotionally present and involved. This not only does not help us to process our old traumas, but it keeps creating more and more trauma, because let's remember what a trauma is. A trauma is something that happens to us when we do not have the awareness to process what is happening. And when we get into these sexual connections, that's exactly what's happening. Most people are having sex because they want to get unconscious just to avoid feeling what their consciousness is continuously bugging them about. Sex is how a lot of people get trauma bonded because...
So when I've talked about Nathan Chasing Horse and limerence, like I'm talking about trauma bonding and the grooming of it, because they're like I said, the image of a young man and his relationship with his father, how his father like interacts with the mother, and all women in society focused around the father image. And so again, when I've talked about promiscuity in other of my podcasts, I've said yes, I was promiscuous when I was younger, but yet again too, with men, especially young men and older men, it seems like a rite of passage, like sow your wild oats before you get married. And yet in the 70s, 80s, 90s, a lot of women who married in trauma bonding, like there's bonding, okay, and then there's trauma bonding. Again, one is extreme, and the one that's extreme needs to have therapy. Like there needs to be some structure in deconstructing and guiding and support. That's what we're talking about clinically. Now, in society, men have been given grace to say, yes, you can be promiscuous. However, when women were taught to be virginal, ideal, like chaste and proper, especially like you look at what Jane Austen's novels and Wuthering Heights and all this English rhetoric. A lot of times in Christianity or in white society, when women married, a lot of times, and I'm saying Indigenous women too. Okay, so I shouldn't just go with religiosity, but again, that's colonial. This is a colonial construct, patriarchy. That on their wedding night, a woman could catch a sexually transmitted disease because her husband had gone out and sowed his wild oats, or on her wedding night she was raped, sexually assaulted, and throughout her whole life, the woman had just thought this is the natural way of having sex. And again, too, that's more of like when a man keeps on pursuing a woman, not because he loves her, but because of the conquest. Like he's hunting and he captures his prey. And keeps his prey captive. Sometimes too, even with like with women, it's taken a long time and a lot of hardship for all women to step back and wonder, why did they stay in such horrible relationships where men would beat the bejesus out of them, or men would just constantly have sexually transmitted diseases, and there they were raising their children, again, bonding with their children, like hormonally, because that's the natural way of women to lose their identity. So here's men having control over a woman's identity and reinforcing this false identity, on projecting it onto her. So eventually the woman decides, okay, there was such a cult called AA, and the women would go to Al-Anon, and my mother went to Al-Anon quite a bit, and again, because of the trauma bond she had with my late father. A lot of these things that I've talked about because I took care of my aging mother, and also I helped quite a bit with her, helping her when she was being trained as a counselor. And again, the influence of my grandparents as well, and my aunties and uncles, and just people in my community. So the notion of why would women continue to stay in such relationships. So a lot of women, especially if they've gone to Al-Anon, they realized as women who were attending these meetings had a lot of similarities in trauma bonding. And so they started their own support group, which was called Limerence, the 12 Steps of Limerence, and how to, we'll say, deprogram themselves from this trauma bond. That it was, they discovered that it was because of the trauma they had lived in childhood as girls, and understanding too that their husbands also had been trauma bond. So understand this: when you have Indigenous people who've been trauma bond in Indian residential schools, in industrial schools, by the greater society, that they're going to trauma bond when they're maturing and becoming sexually aware and active. And a lot of times the trauma bond will never be broken. So you have, like I said, when I talk about B1 and B2, like the trauma bond and the lack of breaking the trauma bond wasn't there for them. So the majority of times when they bonded with women, consensual, and they had all these children, that's part of that whole scenario of limerence and accountability. Whereas there's the other part with W and R who also were trauma bond, but somehow that need to control was more powerful than, because the women, like some of it was consensual, but the majority of it churned into non-consensual. This play of power dynamics of being in a position of power where they can take away a person's freedom, like in terms of fascism. So again, the whole relationship between men and their fathers, but at the same time too, when we're talking about this awareness of the capacity of what it is that a woman has to do to understand like how they can deprogram themselves and learn to heal and process and find to have their central nervous system balanced. Especially, it's a lot harder for women because, again, the trauma bond can also be bonded when they start having children, and their identity again is being captivated rather than them being assertive to who they are or who they believe they are.
When you're in the right.
So, I mean, I just find it so interesting in that sense. So, let's see here.
Sex is how a lot of people...
So, that lady, her handle is Vulnerable Gangster. The last one that we have.
Sex is how a lot
of... now I'm trying to go through this.
Let's stop pretending this is complicated. Donald Trump didn't rise because he's brilliant. He rose because he's rich, reckless, and protected by a system that rewards whiteness even when it fails. What Trump did was give mediocrity a microphone. He showed America that you do not need intellect, you don't need integrity or competence to gain power. If you got the money, you got the entitlement. He became living proof that average men with no depth can fail upward indefinitely. And mediocre men love him for it. Because Trump represents their fantasy. The fantasy that success should be automatic, that power should be inherited, that dominance should be guaranteed, not earned. When reality challenged that fantasy, when black people started thriving, women started leading, immigrants started building, and education started mattering, they didn't rise to compete. They panicked. And Trump became their security blanket. So let's talk about the truth of who he is. He called countries with black people in his shithole countries while saying that he wanted more Europeans to immigrate. He spread racist lies about Haitians eating cats and dogs. He said the most vile and disgusting things about Rob Reiner's death. He called Democrats treasonous and suggested they be punished by death. Trump does this every single time he's pressed for the truth because liars panic when facts show up. This movement is not driven by greatness. It's obviously driven by failure. These are men who had a 400-year head start and blew it. Instead of doing the work, they chose resentment. Instead of building skills, They chose to blame. Instead of evolving, they chose a con artist who made failure feel righteous. Trump gives failed men comfort. He tells them that their mediocrity is not their fault. Black success feels like white failure because it exposes the truth. Black excellence shines a light on laziness. Black resilience highlights weakness. And Black progress reveals who never developed real skill. And instead of competing, they complain. Instead of growing, they attack. Instead of admitting they fell short, they follow a man who made falling short patriotic. Donald Trump does not think he is like them. He is using them. He's exploiting their fear, their resentment, and their inability to keep up. And let's end with the truth America keeps up. Donald Trump's rise to power did not reveal greatness. It revealed the true intellect of this country. It exposed how intellectually bankrupt and racially sick America still is. That a nation would rather choose a loud, lying con artist convicted of multiple felonies, siphoning money from the economy, than accept a Black man whose radical idea was health care for all. Donald Trump did not trick America. America chose him, and that choice told the world everything it needs to know about who this country protects, who it fears, and who it is willing to sacrifice to preserve white comfort. Now drop a Black fist in the comments and share this with someone who needs to hear this gem.
And again, this is the whole point. I've grown up around white people my entire life, and every time sort of that I percolate to the top, it's like, not wanting to validate me. Or even if they try to validate me, they say, I'm sorry, on behalf of all white people, I'm sorry. Again, even that in itself doesn't need to happen, because history, I've already been in that my whole life, that the reality of it, like the inability to put boundaries down. Like my accomplishments and what I've been able to do and how I understand things is based just on the hard work I've done. And the hard work of a lot of Indigenous women, like around my age, who've done so much hard work. Now, again, too, there's a lot of other people who don't. And that's why, like, when this lady talks about Trump and how he rose to power, because of money. And it's the same thing in politics here in Sutina. When people get voted into chief and council, it's like a mythology. It's like a fantasy. I've heard comments like, "Oh, I want to get into chief and council. Why?" So on my gravestone, it'll say, "I was a former band counselor." I'm going, if that is the ultimatum, if that is the top of the echelon in the pyramid that you rise to because that what does it give? It gives you some status. Why? Because you were voted in. Like, it's not a popularity contest, but a lot of people, based on money, based on narcissism and Machiavellian ways of just self-destruction, self-destructive behavior, just the notion of greediness or shame or guilt or fear. I've grown up here my whole life. And for me to have seen some families that were so poor, who are now millionaires. And it's not saying I'm jealous. It's the fact that these people who've risen to power hurt a lot of people. And it's proof in the pudding in terms of being named in lawsuits for millions of dollars, of how they took money from our like the whole process of procurement for things. Not only that too, but even using money and positions of power to groom people to work for them. Not just with chief and council, but in their own private sector, in their own businesses. To the point now that they're even being charged with sexual assault. All this plays out in a lifetime. And before this person was arrested and had all these charges within my community, I had said, the forensic psychologist who was his therapist had said to tribal police that he had, in private, this wasn't a report, because he had a chance to report him anonymously, which to me is why I'm no longer associated with this individual. When I heard him say that this person had a propensity for boys, and then within 2 years he's being charged with 2 historical assaults on men. And not just that, like in the past month, all of a sudden he's listed in this tie-up with our recovery center that Danielle Smith supposedly has no accountability for. And yet the year before, this former leader had a woman go to a demonstration reading a letter that he was not associated with Danielle Smith. And yet look at the evidence that the Toronto Globe and Mail posted about this whole scandalous issue. So, yes, I mean, when I talk about these men, B1 and B2 and R and W, I'm talking about men's behavior towards women. And the reality of it is like the B1 and B2 have always shown me respect, whereas R and W haven't. They hate the very ground I walk on. With R, when he'd see me in public, he'd just come. All of a sudden, he'd realize he was close to my proximity, and he'd just stare the other way or walk the other way. And W, I happened to I had to go to his place, and he just swore at me, like, don't even, like, I don't talk to them, I don't engage with them, and yet they have this hatred towards me. Yet B1 and B2, like, they call me by my childhood name, Hapon. Like they engage with me and they show me respect. So again, because I'm looking in terms of matriarchy and the notion of consent and pair bonding. Understand the notion of pair bonding. We're not talking about trauma bonding. Again, probably W and R have only known pair bonding, whereas B1 and B2 have known about bonding, which is why I think it's so important for me to play these clips, because they do mean something to me, and I hope they do mean something to you as well.
Conservative Christians need rape culture. It's not a bug. It's the only way their hierarchy survives. I realized this after listening to the podcast Campus Files, specifically their episode about Baylor's sexual assault crisis. In it, they detail how Baylor University was a conservative Baptist institution, and as such, students were not allowed to drink or have premarital sex. The Baylor administration also discouraged students from reporting sexual assault. On top of that, football players in the Baylor program were protected from sexual assault claims by their coach, Art Briles. Baylor created a system where victims of sexual assault were ignored, while the perpetrators of that sexual assault were allowed to continue with impunity. Listen to the podcast, it's excellent. But this behavior is not unique to Baylor. It's common within conservative Christianity. See, conservative Christianity is built around a patriarchal hierarchy. The man is the head of the household, and the women, in turn, are supposed to submit to the men. What if women don't want to submit, though? That's where the threat of sexual violence comes in. Conservative Christian men use rape culture to keep women underneath their heel. Oh, you think it's bad that your husband doesn't treat you with love or respect? Well, you need him to treat you well, or otherwise he won't protect you from other men who would assault you. This is the promise of the patriarchal hierarchy. If you submit, you will be protected. Conservative men need rape culture because they know that no group would voluntarily submit to subjugation unless they were forced into it. Individuals might, but as a group, you cannot force people into subjugation without coercion. Here's the catch. Men care more about the hierarchy than they do about women. This idea of protection is just window dressing. Fundamentally, the patriarchal hierarchy is more important than the women that they claim to love. This is why institutions like Baylor or the SBC or the Republican Party will continue to side with abusers over the people who have been abused. It's never been about love, it's always been about power and control. A system rooted in love would strike down abusers, not elect them. Jesus warns us about this in Matthew 19. In that time, men could divorce their wives for any reason, which would force them into destitution. Jesus says if a man marries a woman, he has to care for her for the rest of his life. No threatening her with destitution because he doesn't like the way that she cooks. That was one of the rulings of a rabbi at the time, that a man could divorce his wife even if she burnt his food. On top of all of this, Jesus says, if you don't want to care for your wife, why don't you cut off your balls? I dare you to read Matthew 19 and see where I'm exaggerating. Jesus warned us about exploitative hierarchies like this. That's why...
So, again, this person is called Pastor Paul D. Dries. And the reason I chose this, not because of religiosity, but because he was talking about Baylor football. And for me, I lived in Utah with BYU football. Okay, and also when I went to Oklahoma State and I was networking with community health there, And again, the Sooners in Oklahoma, when I was talking to the fellow who worked for the University of Oklahoma, he said these women, the millionaires' wives, they would wine and dine quarterbacks and all these young, studs that were in the football, buying them brand new cars, just like they bought them. They bought these players. Now, it wasn't so evident at BYU, but like with Baylor, when he's talking about like how sexual assault and just the whole notion of keeping it quiet, the reason I'm focusing on this because he was talking about like the position of power and control, and again in Indigenous communities, when you have leadership who suppress sexual assault, and they protect the serial rapists. They protect the people who prey on the most vulnerable women and children. This why when I talk about cults, it's a form of it's cultish in the sense that because the victims, the vulnerable ones, have never had justice or their voice haven't had the ability to talk freely about being a sexual assault victim, because the powers that be in terms of a leadership have tried for decades to have control over these. And I use this as an example, like I said, with Nathan Chasing Horse 20 years ago. The 14, 15-year-olds, like the two that were 14 turned 15, the one right off the bat chose to try and charge Nathan Chasing Horse. 5 years until 2015, she had advocated and struggled to get her voice known and done, and yet no compensation for her being a victim, because again it didn't go to trial and it never will, because he's serving life sentence in Nevada. But the reality of it is, like, the whole community knows she was a victim. The whole country of Canada knows she's a victim. So again, why isn't leadership compensating this young woman for the advocacy she did for herself? Whereas the other victims of Nathan Chasing Horse freely joined his cult, took part in whatever abuse he gave them because of trauma bonds, and no fault of their own, they were children when he took them. Again, even as they grew up and still were associated with him, or as they left, the chief and council were still paying for their livelihood, their rent, their travel, all that. But yet, because they were members of Nathan's cult. That's why, for me, when I say it's the powers that be that show how much control or power they have over the membership, over the most vulnerable, the women and children within my community. So yes, my podcast does do a lot of nitpicking or uncovering or explanation of why it's important for people to celebrate things that young women have accomplished. And for me, just the fact that women left Nathan Chasing Horse's cult is something to be celebrated, as well as this young woman who advocated and wasn't even a part of Nathan's cult. She again, the same thing with my niece who passed away. There were young girls who knew. I mean, it took my niece a while before she realized, what was happening to her or what happened to her. So it all ties into everyday living, because, like I said, this is something out there that all women go through, and I'm not saying that it's a natural thing.
When you're in the right state of mind for it, because this one is a doozy, I highly recommend reading this article, and I'm going to go through some of the highlights of it. The men who want women to be quiet. The article dives into masculinism, which is apparently the misogynistic answer to feminism. The author writes, masculinism has been a great gift because factions with different views on, say, protectionism or Israel or big tech can all agree on the overreach of feminism and the need for a return to traditional gender roles. Far from being a fringe belief system, masculinism has become the single most important force uniting the American right.
bringing together an unlikely constellation of pastors, posters, senators, preachers, influencers, podcasters, and fanboys. She writes,
so that's one of the reasons too why I'm doing my podcast, is because for everything that I do or say, there is somebody out there who's doing the...
Sex is how a lot of people get trauma bonded because...
So sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt like that, but no, there's a reason why it's important.
Conservative Christians need rape.
Let's stop.
So I don't want to repeat or anything.
Conservative Christians need...
And normally I have these marked and labeled, but we'll see what happens here.
Did you know that Canada has a piece of legislation that decides who is or isn't an Indian? Welcome back to my series, The Indian Act, What Canada is Not Teaching You. In my last two videos, we talked about the history of the Indian Act and band council systems, and now it is time to talk about status cards and what they mean. So what you are looking at here is my status card, and what this plastic card means is that there is an extra layer of Canadian law or legislation that decides who I am. And some people confuse this with Section 35 rights, but we will talk about that later. So after amendments happened to the Indian Act back in the 1950s, the federal government created something called the Indian Register. And this is the federal government's master list of who they have registered as status Indians in the country. So although that list began, physical status cards actually came into effect in the 1980s, and they originally started with a piece of laminated paper, and then they moved over to plastic in the last decade or so. And how this connects back to the Indian Act is that the Indian Act decides who is entitled to be registered. It established the creation of the Indian Register and also establishes federal authority over our identity. So you will hear the term Indigenous pretty broadly when describing First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. However, under the Indian Act, only status First Nations people are considered Indian. It does not include Métis or Inuit people. And over the years, there has been amendments done to the Indian Act because it used to be pretty discriminatory in nature, meaning First Nations women that married non-First Nations men would lose their status, things like that. And one of the misconceptions about the Indian Act is that people believe that our identity is directly tied to the Indian Register or to the Act. But our identity does not come from the Canadian government deciding who does or doesn't belong. It comes to our connection, our communities, all of those things, our culture. And even in 2026, there's currently bills going through Parliament and the Senate that have to do with our identity and long-standing discrimination that has affected our identity because of the Indian Act. Another misconception is that you cannot be status without belonging to a band. You actually can be status and recognized by the federal government without having been registered to a First Nations band. And status is lost through things like the second generation cutoff, and if you continue to procreate with non-Indigenous people, eventually your kids and your grandkids will no longer hold status under the Indian Act. And if the federal government identified you as a status Indian back in the day, there were some pretty heavy restrictions that came with that, including things like not being allowed to leave the reservation without permission. You were not allowed to hire a lawyer. Ceremonies were banned. And lastly, some parts of the Act actually differ depending on whether or not you reside on or off reserve. But yeah, that's my little update. My next video will talk about some of those provisions like...
And that's Jennifer L. Now, why did I put that in there? Is because, yes, the discriminatory act towards women who married non-status, and just the fact, too, like she said, under the Indian Act, like Métis and Inuit were not considered status. You have to understand, too, there were 9 Sioux tribes that were part of that. The 9 Sioux, there were, I think, 8 Dakota and 1 Lakota tribe in Canada who were not considered under the Indian Act until 2 years ago, along with the Métis and Inuit. So again, a lot of this, when we talk about culture and identity, and when we talk about, like, say, especially identity when it comes to women, like we're the most vulnerable when it comes to our identity. Like I said, genetically, every woman, like Indian, black, white, yellow, green, whatever you want to say in terms of women, every woman who chooses to have a child, because of their hormones and creating life, their whole identity is tied up with that child at birth. So being vulnerable when you're a woman who chooses to have children, dictated by environment, social constructs, without the guidance of other women to help you when you've bonded with your mate, when that's taken away and say initially you've done a trauma bond rather than a bond, then it's more devastating. It affects your very mental health. And so that's why there's a crisis. That's why, like, the ownership or the control of power over women was already dictated by a colonial construct, then adopted and taught by the Indian agent to Indigenous men, and some women freely participate to this day, this whole colonial construct of like who has identity. And again, the notion too is that a lot of communities, a lot of Inuit, Métis, First Nations, don't have the funds to actively do a good membership role, like to be voted in. I believe Sutana does, but again too, it's the construct of applying. So you can belong to the general role in Ottawa. And this is what this young woman was saying. There are 2 bills that are being passed. One is going to allow people who, because of the attachment to, or the legacy of being the descendant of a female who lost her status, eventually now they're going to be grandfathered in, but they'll be on the general list in Ottawa. Their choice to apply to Métis or Inuit or First Nations is up to them, and how each community welcomes them in. And again, that's where the controversy comes in on Métis, because the equivalent of Métis for my American audience is the same as people identifying as Cherokee in the United States. Cherokee, though, they're the most documented in terms of legacy in people proving if they actually have Cherokee bloodline. Whereas in Canada, yes, we do have that, but it's not as sophisticated as the Cherokee enrollment, which again, I think a lot of the controversy with Inuit and First Nations, and especially a lot of the people who are getting back on the general list, that there is going to, they are the ones who are going to validate exactly, and stop that notion of pretendianism of who and why they want to claim to be Indigenous. Okay, so again, like I'm saying, power and control, having the ability to dictate to women whether or not they belong or don't. And again, even in the Indian Act too, in 2026, like I keep on saying, they're going to change the act so Indigenous people will have sovereignty over their own child and family. It's some people may think, oh, that's nothing new.
Oh, you people just pull yourselves up from your bootstraps. What's the matter with you? The playing field has been leveled. Well, we're going to see if, in fact, it's been leveled. Or is that conjecture?
This is a clip from a lecture given by Dr. Joy DeGruy about post-traumatic slave disorder. Dr. DeGruy is an author, educator, and researcher who examines how slavery and generations of racial oppression continue to shape society. In this clip, she discusses a lynching photograph and focuses on the white children calmly witnessing the violence. She argues that atrocities of slavery didn't only affect black people, it also conditioned others to accept the cruelty without empathy. Her message challenges the idea that the past doesn't matter and explains why its effects can't simply be dismissed by saying move on.
Now, I want you to look at this photo very closely, and I want you to see who's in it. More important than the man hanging, because you got to understand the lynchings that occurred in America happened after slavery, not during. Thousands of lynchings happened after slavery, because this is a reaction to white fear of what we would do once free. But we didn't create a vigilante group to take out white people, but they did create a vigilante group to take us out now that we're free. See, that happened after slavery. They were called the what? The Ku Klux Klan. They don't wear hoods anymore, they wear suits. But they're alive and well all over the world, even here. So, look at who's in the picture. I want you to look at this little girl in particular. You can't see her closely, but she's actually grimacing, like smirking. Now, remember, let's go back to the puppy concept here. She would be loathed and torn up probably if this was a puppy. which means he's less than that. Because she's not disturbed. This little girl is not disturbed by this. But she should be, shouldn't she? People always ask me, and go, Joy, what was the impact on white people? There it is. Right there. Can't feel any empathy for him. None, zero, zip. There's a little one back here, even smaller. Because whatever she's been taught or told, socialized to believe, makes him no longer human. That's the greatest danger to white people, is that they can't feel it. And there's a reason why white people can't feel what we're talking about. My God, what would you then feel? It's tough. So I've got to believe, oh, it's all over now, it's not my fault, I don't benefit, it's not a big deal, let's move on, it's not all of those things. But we don't say that to Jewish people. I dare you. But you have to understand, when you unearth this one, that's what we did to our children. Oh, you people just pull yourselves up from your bootstrap.
See, I want to end with that because when we talk about white supremacy and we talk about systemic racism, that's the analogy she gave with the little girl grimacing as she's seeing a black person hung. And again, too, even with empathy, that she would have more empathy towards a puppy than she would towards a black person. And again, I want you to understand this. I'm a Canadian Indigenous person. I've lived in the United States. The reality of here's a reality. When I talk about Indigenous, Inuit, or Métis Indigenous people, we're talking about Canadians. When an Indigenous person, a Native American from the United States, tries to come into Canada, like we as Canadian Indigenous people can go into the United States under the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty was the first treaty signed as a country, the United States. That was their first treaty, called Jay Treaty, which they recognized the Indigenous people of Canada as being indigenous to the Americas. So we can cross into the United States as like dual citizens. Now, Native American Indians cannot do the same coming into Canada. So when Canadian people or the far right or the separatists, when they're thinking about like systemic racism, when a Native American has tried to come into Canada to live, they find it so harsh. They find it so difficult to live with systemic racism. And this is how the analogy of how they perceive Indigenous people in Canada. They say, when the king says jump, you say, Your Majesty, how high do you want me to jump? And you jump. See, that's the mentality they feel when they come into Canada. Systemic racism. I mean, mind you, they have racism in the United States. But because 10% of the American population is black, the majority of black people, like I said, this narrative of how the white people show no empathy. They were taught to see black people a certain way. And this is how Canadian society has seen Indigenous people. And I say this to my Native American friends in the United States who are listening. When you come into Canada or even want to visit, and a lot of Native Americans don't, a lot of them can't even live here for like a year. Some do successfully, but they're mostly academic. But the majority of them, when they come into Canada and they're being treated like how black people are treated in the United States, they can't handle it. They cannot handle the systemic racism that Indigenous people in Canada face every day. So yes, when this lady, Warrior, the man who posted this is Warrior DW2. When he says, what happens when you take away that systemic racism? How like when you have to feel, because see the thing is, when you have no empathy, that means you're not feeling, and so who would you be when you're actually able to feel? And that's why when I talk about cults and I talk about breaking away from the cult or stop drinking the Kool-Aid, then you have to have a lot of self-reflection, and it's very heartbreaking to self-reflect on why, what things you were taught, why you cannot feel. Like it's not a question. Like it's so embedded that you say, well, I can't feel what's happening, and it's handed down. Like this past week, there was an accident where two corrections officers were transporting a young Indigenous woman. She was 24, Kara Masuza, I think, Masua. And she had children. But when the accident happened, they focused nationwide on the two correction officers being killed. Didn't even mention this Indigenous 24-year-old. And again, this, some people, again, they don't want to feel, they don't want to have empathy for this woman and the children she left behind. So the critique here is like, why wasn't she protected? How come she wasn't even named? Like there needs to be something set up for her children. That was part of the comment. But for me, it's like, no, somebody needs to sue the government because she was under their protection. See, in the penal system in Canada, which is different than the United States, and I'm pretty sure it's for both men and women, that when men in prison get sexually assaulted, they can sue the guards for not protecting them. That's a law. Okay, so again, these correction officers can get sued for not protecting an inmate if they've been sexually assaulted. So again, what is it that, yes, they lost their lives, but it's the responsibility of the people that were supposed to be taking care of this inmate, this woman, Kiara Musawa. See, that's they can fight it in legal courts, but again, because the lack of empathy, the news media. I know one of my childhood friends says, she says, I have no faith in APTN, and this is an Indigenous organization. She says, it's always focused on Manitoba or Saskatchewan, never Alberta. This happened in Alberta. And again, too, here's Alberta, like in terms of separatism, in terms of all those separatists, those white supremacists who were doing combat duty or whatever. Again, just south of here, and again, all these blue flags that are hanging around and flying in southern Alberta. Yes, it's cause for concern. It has to. Because again, it has to do with the lack of empathy. The lack of empathy. When Danielle Smith says to the chiefs of Alberta to check themselves and to warn them that if they put out any blockades or do anything, that, like what? The RCMP are going to come in, arrest the chiefs of Alberta? Like, it's cause for concern because of the lack of empathy or the understanding of what systemic racism is all about. Especially when it's so programmed or so, we'll say, so promiscuous of how the narrative suits systemic racism or white privilege because of the lack of understanding of how things have historically set in play. Especially when, again, I go back to slavery, especially when Indigenous people, because white society did not get it. They biologically were killing us off because of the diseases they brought into the Americas. Not only that, but their whole irrational thinking of breeding black people to serve them. And then when there was so much protests with Martin Luther King, everything happening in terms of empowerment and talking about history and the tragedies and the genocide of black women and women of color in the Americas, and how today it still persists with Indigenous women in Canada. And the reality of it is, like, as a woman, I'm talking about this because I have nieces and nephews. I have people who need to understand that when people are raised to not feel, They feel more for the correction officers than they did for this 24 Indigenous woman. When they're conditioned not to have empathy, they're taught this. When I do my podcast and I try to teach about the reasoning why, when oil was discovered, they had to start industrial schools, and they recruited a lot of mixed blood Indigenous boys. Again, their whole premise is that we were savages and incapable of being slaves. So they had to try and teach us how to be good housekeepers, good farmers, good farmhands, good ranching hands. They just like with black people, they never really even considered that we would get educated, that we would become doctors, lawyers, leaders. You know, it just the whole notion that all of a sudden their fragility, their lack of understanding of human behavior, or even the gumption to even understand that like, hello, our lives do matter. We do have people who don't forget us. All the women that I buried, all the women that I dressed in their funeral gowns, all the wakes and organizations, and I'm not saying like I did this like in the sense of like you know, I'm only saying this because I know those people, those women, their lives meant something to me. And they just didn't live their lives like the way, because of how people think they lived, and because they were taught that way, or they grimaced and looked at them as if they were lower than a snake's belly, that their lives didn't matter. When I'm going, why? Even if I make a comment and it offends you as a white woman, why does it offend you? It's one thing to apologize for all the colonial constructs, but the proof is in the pudding. And for me, like I said, I can have conflict with my siblings, with my people in my community, with acquaintances, but the proof is in the pudding. And that comes from years and different times when my identity has evolved, breaking away from different cults, different ways of thinking, evolving, empowering my identity, and again, growing from that. And that is the lesson. And that's why I think it's harder for people who lack empathy, why they cannot feel. They're so scared, because what would they be without that identity? See, when I talk about my parents and my grandparents, and I talk about intergenerational trauma, and I talk about Nietzsche Institute, and I talk about how all these Indigenous people who have passed away now used their way of thinking in terms of their identity and healing. Because that took a lot of hard work, a lot of forgiveness, a lot of evolution in terms of identity for thousands of Indigenous people within our communities. And that's why I don't like to use or hear the word resilience, because it's just a poo-poo word. It's a poo-poo word because systemic racism uses that word. They don't have the courage to actually start feeling. Like it's brutal. It's brutal to feel. Like I said, I buried a lot of my relatives, female. And again, within our communities, we see a lot of death. And it's how we process it and how we share and how we bond with each other. That's why this whole notion of religiosity and the need to control and govern women's bodies and women's rights, it's being felt, and it's a crisis, not just with women of color, but more so with white women. And it's more critical because I think it's really attacking their mental health. That's just my opinion. That's just my opinion. And that's why I think it's important for people to understand. If Daniel Smith says to check yourself, maybe it's a reflection of what she really needs to do for herself. It's a really, that she needs to really check herself, deprogram herself, break away from the way her lack of feeling, her lack of empathy. That's just my opinion. Again, I just hope it would rain. And I thank you for listening to me. I hope what I've shared has some meaning and foundation for you. It's just, sometimes it's just not fair. But again, people are people depend on other people. And if I could help in any way, help people guide and understand, sometimes the way we think or the lack of forgiveness or understanding, or even realizing that yes, our life changes. We're never the same. That's what life is all about. So be kind to yourself, love yourself. Trauma bonding and bonding are two different things. And like I gave an example of men, I call them B1 and B2 and R and W. It's important. It's important to understand the choices that we can make, and that there is the possibility of romantic relationships. It takes a lot of hard work, and it takes a lot of self-reflection, and it takes a lot of trust. And like I said, I'm an elder. It takes decades. It's not something that can just happen in one therapy session or being with a therapist for a year. It all depends. It all depends on your capacity. Well, with that, I'll let you go. Again, in Dakota, Wopida Midakio Pio Wasana. That means we're all related. Thank you, we're all related. And again, thanks Darcy and Marie for listening. And if anybody else there is listening and want to add your name to the list of how I greet people, you're welcome.